Capital investment budgets. I thought this surprised me to see this, because I know the international institutions put a lot of emphasis on the capital investment budgeting, and certainly for low-income countries. But it really doesn't start becoming an issue until countries, I think, are having more of their own resources that they're investing rather than the donor resources. They're more of their own money that's going into capital investments, so you see an increase in the interest in reforms and improvements in capital budgeting. Budget execution, there are some similar patterns that are emerging. In Treasury cash management, I think this is starting to get us in the direction of what are some of the essential reforms that a small or a low-income country need to be able to manage their finances. Treasury systems and cash management is a fundamental element. And so that's why I think you see a lot of activity in Treasury and cash management in low-income countries in particular, and it somewhat drops off in the low and upper middle-income countries, but mainly because there's still ongoing improvements that can always be made to comprehensiveness and things like that. So there's always some reforms to Treasury that can be made. But the big activity is in the low-income country, and that may be an area that's worthy of more attention when we're working with countries than some of the budget formulation areas. Commitment control is very similar, trying to get control of their own spending. And then you have various other trends here, which I don't want to spend too much time on. But I will note one in particular I thought was interesting was payroll. Again, kind of a bimodal distribution in terms of the level of interest or activity from countries. I think the lower levels, at the low-income countries, the activity is much more geared towards finding out what is your payroll and trying to control the size of the payroll. And the upper middle-income country reforms are much more civil service oriented. Pay rates, attracting good staff, training programs, and managing your payroll, not necessarily for ghost workers, but trying to be more efficient in hiring, etc. So those are some, I think, interesting trends emerging out of the fund's data and information on what's happening in countries. I've included some other reforms which I think don't quite fit into budget formulation, budget execution. These are more cross-cutting types of issues. Integrated financial management systems. What surprised me was the degree of activity in the low-income countries on this. Their integrated systems or automated systems are frequently advocated as a solution to shortages of staff or shortages of skills in developing countries. And that's an assumption I think that's worthy of challenging. I did a review a few years ago of the World Bank's, about 32 World Bank projects in IFMISs, and the success rate, you can measure it different ways, but the success rate in terms of sustainable reforms was about 6%, which is a fairly low rate. And it suggests that maybe we're doing it either in the wrong way or advocating it in the wrong situation, in the wrong circumstances, for the wrong reasons. So more attention to what's being recommended, more lessons, I think, are important. Again, IFMIS is a standard recommendation you see almost in every country you go to. Ministry of Finance reorganization. This is actually something I'm seeing more and more in Latin America in particular, but also in Asia, and even in Eastern Europe for that matter, where there's more concerns about the way the Ministry of Finance is organized, that it's been overtaken by events, interest in building a stronger Ministry of Finance, a realization that there's been fragmentation, so there's increasing requests. And in particular, low and middle income countries, I think, are grappling with this issue because at that stage they have legacy systems that they're trying to overcome. Separate planning and budgeting being a classic example, where they're trying to implement some reforms in the Ministry of Finance to overcome those barriers in the separation of capital and current budgeting. So not that it gets solved at the upper middle income status, but it becomes certainly a priority issue at the lower middle income level. It's a barrier to actually implementing and managing their budget. Legal changes, pretty consistent throughout, but lower middle income, again, I think legal changes represent the fact that they're trying to overcome some of the legacy systems they may have in place, the remnants of old systems that exist, be it in Eastern Europe, the former Soviet Union, or in Asia. Transparency, a favorite topic of the IMF and many others as well. This is something that is fairly consistent throughout, but again, lower middle income status, I think you start seeing some external demands for accountability, external demands for more information. It becomes more of a priority issue for countries to try to invest in creating more transparency. And it's also one of the areas that is most easily progress is made on. I mean, even if the data isn't perfect, you can become more transparent fairly easily. So these are pretty low-cost reforms that can be implemented. Public-private partnerships and decentralization, again, two other themes that get pushed on countries. I'm not always sure that the rationale is correct, but it certainly complicates the daylights out of implementing treasury and public finance systems to do this. And it's being recommended in countries as small as 600,000 people, which you'd wonder, what are you going to decentralize, or what are you decentralizing to at that level? What is the meaning of decentralization when you have that many people? But again, you see it in almost all of the recommendations coming out of all of the international institutions, including bilateral donors. This is not just the international institutions. Now, a few kind of observations I want to leave you with. One is on low-income countries. In many low-income countries, they're still struggling to get the basics in place. Some of the work done by the Bank and Fund a few years ago on the HIPIC expenditure tracking, which we looked at 24 countries in Africa and Latin America, low-income debt countries, we found that many of the basics were not in place. Countries were moving on medium-term expenditure frameworks and some very advanced reforms, and they were not even providing regular reporting in year. The Minister of Finance might get one report during the fiscal year of what's the state of the public finances. That's simply not sufficient to manage your finances. I mean, it's just, and there's a whole series of issues like that in terms of frequency of reporting. About half of the countries, if I recall correctly, were not reconciling their accounting system with their cash, right? So you couldn't trust the data that was coming out of the accounting system. Money was being spent directly out of the central bank. So if those basics aren't in place, you question the value of some of these more advanced reforms, especially if there's limited capacity that can be applied to improving the system. Where are you going to get the biggest bang for the buck? Is it in your downstream issues, budget execution, or is it in medium-term expenditure frameworks? I mean, my preference would certainly be for the basics, getting the basics in place. Low and middle and upper middle income countries are, as I mentioned before, are struggling to overcome legacy systems. They have the basics in place in many cases, but it's not working terribly well because of the bifurcation of planning and budgeting and various other things that might exist. I've recently seen a slight movement away from some of these big bang reforms, from medium-term expenditure frameworks as a huge reform that needs to be implemented fully within 3 years or less in a country. There's been some movement towards unbundling the concept, looking at a 10, 15-year horizon for implementing some of these reforms, which is far more realistic for most of the countries that we're dealing with, including developed countries. I mean, the US doesn't even have a full medium-term expenditure framework, and it's been working on it for a number of years. And IFMIS, I've seen a bit of a discussion occurring recently in some knowledge groups about taking out the I. Let's not have an integrated system that has every bell and whistle, procurement and personnel and everything else, and let's get some basic automation in place to help with reporting and management, perhaps in the accounting area, general ledger, some of the core functions.